Genesis tells the story of woman's creation twice. Two accounts, just one chapter apart, and they do not contradict each other by accident. For 15 centuries, the institution chose which of the two it wanted you to forget. One Hebrew word. It appears only once in the entire biblical text, in chapter 34 of the book of Isaiah, verse 14. Christian translators rendered it as owl, sometimes as screech owl, a bird of the night, slipped in among jackals and satyrs in a prophecy of desolation. But the word did not mean a bird. It meant a woman, Lilith. Picture a scribe bent over a Hebrew manuscript, a lamp set a little too close to the parchment so as not to waste oil. He translates verse after verse, and then he comes upon this solitary word, Lilith, a word that appears nowhere else in the entire body of text he is translating. No parallel term to confirm it, no narrative context to settle the question. So the scribe consults an older colleague, someone who passed through that same passage years before. A woman's name here, in the middle of ruins and wild beasts? That would be strange. Better to make it a bird. Birds do nest in the rubble. That is how the choice is made, passed down from one generation of translators to the next, copied over without anyone ever reopening the case. A proper name becomes a zoological detail. And for centuries, no one thinks to ask why a mere winged creature would deserve such precise grammar in the original text. Why erase a proper name by replacing it with a bird? That is the first question this case file will answer. But before we can answer it, we have to go back further than the book of Isaiah. We have to open a text that the rabbinic establishment itself long preferred to keep quiet. That text is called the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Scholars date it to around the 10th century, and it first circulated in Jewish communities of the East as a satirical tale interwoven with learned commentary. A copyist works at night, in a room with no window facing the street, the door bolted shut. In front of him lie two stacks of parchment. On one side, the approved commentaries he will copy out in daylight for the community waiting for them. On the other, this text, which he is copying for a single recipient, a learned friend who requested it in confidence. He slips the finished sheets between two heavier covers, the way someone hides an incriminating letter inside an account book. It is not a forbidden text in the strict sense. It is a text people would rather not see circulating under the eyes of the most rigorous authorities. A text passed from hand to hand rather than from the pulpit to the congregation. And in the middle of its pages, there is a scene you will not find in any Bible printed today, Christian or Jewish. God shapes a woman for Adam, not from a rib, from the same earth, beside him, in the same act. The text gives her a name, Lilith, and it tells what happens next with almost bureaucratic precision, the first marital dispute ever put into writing. "Why should I lie beneath you," she says, "when we were formed from the same dust?" That is the line the Alphabet of Ben Sira places in her mouth, a claim to equality, voiced in a text that official tradition shelved in the most dangerous corner of its library, minor writings, stories never quoted from the pulpit. Some medieval rabbinic authorities judged the text obscene, while others saw it as nearly heretical. For centuries, its circulation remained marginal. Why would a simple folktale so deeply trouble scholars who were perfectly used to commenting on texts far more violent? The answer lies in a single chapter of Genesis, the one that comes before the story of the rib. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. The text is clear, with no grammatical ambiguity. God creates the human being, male and female, in the same verse, in the same breath. No hierarchy in the raw material, no rib taken away. A couple created simultaneously, in the image of the same God. Then comes chapter 2, a second creation story. Adam alone, formed from clay, then put to sleep, then a rib removed to form a companion. Two textual traditions, stitched side by side, which scholars have long distinguished by their vocabulary and style. In other words, two possible women for one Adam. Rabbinic readers of the early Middle Ages were not unaware of this tension. Some comment on it explicitly. One question runs through their reading. What do we do with that first woman from chapter 1 if Eve does not appear until chapter 2? The alphabet of Ben Sira offers a dizzying answer. The first woman has not vanished from the text. She has a name, she refuses, and she leaves. She speaks the ineffable name of God, and she flies away toward the Red Sea. A woman created as man's equal, choosing exile over submission. That is what a text was telling, somewhere between the Byzantine East and the learned circles of the 10th century. A text that official history filed away under curiosities. But this story did not remain a mere scholarly debate. It fed a much older, much more tangible fear. A fear that slipped into the rooms at night where newborn children slept. In medieval Jewish communities across Europe and the Near East, families would hang an amulet made of parchment or engraved metal above the cradle. 3 names always appeared on it: Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloff. According to tradition, they were 3 angels charged with holding back a winged female figure who wandered at night, trying to get close to children. A mother sets an oil lamp beside the cradle. She checks the cord of the amulet one more time before snuffing out the flame. Outside, the silence of the village feels unnaturally thick. She does not sleep until the child is asleep. She has heard the names that must be fastened to the wood of the bed, and she repeats them, almost like a prayer, before closing her eyes. That fear was not some isolated piece of folklore. It passed through households, generations, and language boundaries. The same nighttime dread carried by the same name, which had become a synonym for danger. A text that, somewhere in its pages, told of the dignity of a first wife who refused submission, had become, in popular memory, the name people feared most above a cradle. That is the paradox this investigation will follow all the way through. One name, 2 opposite paths. One, a claim to equality set down in a manuscript. The other, a domestic terror passed from mother to daughter. Between the two, a century of rabbinic texts would shift Lilith from one role to the other. And that shift was no scribal accident. Because the alphabet of Ben Sira is only the first document in this case file, there is a second, older one, preserved in the Babylonian Talmud. And what that text says about the same figure will surprise you in a different way. Let's recap what the evidence has established so far. A Hebrew word erased in translation. A medieval text that gives this woman a name, the same origin as Adam, and a refusal. A second creation account in Genesis that seems to confirm such a woman could have existed before Eve. And yet no one in classical rabbinic literature can explain why a nocturnal figure bearing that same name appears in sources far older than the alphabet of Ben Sira, centuries before that text gave her a face and a story. To understand that earlier history, we first need to look more closely at what rabbinic tradition did with the 2 creation accounts in Genesis, because the reading it offers is anything but unanimous. Some medieval commentators, comparing Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, chose a solution that avoids any duplication at all. They read the first account as an anticipatory summary, a kind of condensed table of contents, and the second as the detailed unfolding of the same event. One single couple, told twice, at 2 different focal lengths. The advantage of that reading is its simplicity. It closes the question before it even opens. Other commentators, in the oldest layers of the Midrash, took a bolder path. They read the first account as the description of an androgynous being, a single human, male and female joined in one body, whom God then separates into 2 in the chapter 2 account. That reading does not deny the tension between the 2 chapters. It turns it into an anatomical mystery rather than a marital one, and it carefully avoids any hint of a separate first wife who lived, refused, and then vanished. 2 reading strategies, 2 ways of diffusing the same textual crack, and neither one mentions Lilith by name. It is precisely that silence that becomes revealing. If the classical rabbinic tradition had simply ignored the existence of a nocturnal figure bearing that name, the silence would pose no problem. But it did not ignore her. The Babylonian Talmud, compiled several centuries before the alphabet of Ben Sira, mentions this figure twice, and in a context that is not literary at all. Tractate Eruvin, folio 100, verso, warns a man against sleeping alone in an empty house, for fear that a winged creature with long hair might come to him in the night. Tractate Shabbat, folio 151, verso, repeats the same warning in almost the same words. One evening, a young student in the study house comes across this passage in Tractate Eruvin, and he looks up at his teacher, a little unsettled. A winged creature with long hair. Why does the text go out of its way to describe her in such detail in a discussion about sleep and solitude? The teacher sets down his pen, thinks for a moment, then answers that the text is not trying to tell a story. It is trying to justify a rule of caution. But then, in a quieter voice, he adds that this description, far too precise for a mere legal warning, has always troubled him as well. A law does not need long hair in order to be obeyed. It only needs a prohibition. The physical detail belongs to something else. To an older story, the text never fully tells, only assumes its reader already knows. That is why the alphabet of Ben Sira was treated with such suspicion by the most hardline authorities, not because it invented an unknown figure, but because it dared to give a story, a voice, and a claim to an entity that the Talmud itself had already mentioned centuries earlier as a faceless, nameless threat of the night. To turn an anonymous menace into a woman who speaks, who argues, who demands equality, that was the act the rabbinic establishment could not allow to circulate without deep reservation. 2 Talmudic tractates, written in a purely legal context, rules of household caution, nothing more. And yet that caution echoed far beyond the study halls. It reached even the humblest homes, into gestures mothers repeated without knowing the exact textual source they came from. In a workshop attached to his home, a scribe who specializes in protective amulets receives a young mother who has come for the 3rd time that month. Her first child, born frail, cries through every night, and nothing will soothe him. The scribe dips his pen and carefully writes the 3 names he has written hundreds of times before: Senoi, Sansanoi, Samangaloff, framing them with a protective verse. He never asks whether the customer understands the Hebrew text he is inscribing. Most do not. They trust the gesture, the form, the repetition handed down from their own mothers. He pierces a small hole in the corner of the parchment, threads a piece of red wool through it, and hands it to the young woman, advising her to hang it from the side of the cradle, never directly above the child's head, always to one side. An ordinary ritual, repeated in hundreds of homes without question, until the day the ritual fails. One night, in a village in Central Europe, an amulet falls from the wall above a cradle. No one notices until morning. The child does not wake up. In their grief, the family does not first look for a medical cause. They look for what gave way, what failed to keep watch that night. The snapped cord of the amulet becomes the silent proof that the protection failed, and the name once whispered for reassurance becomes, in sorrow, the name they blame. That reflex runs through centuries and across cultures without ever truly disappearing. The urge to find a face, a name, a malevolent will behind a loss nothing else can explain. Modern medicine has a clinical term for these unexplained nighttime deaths. Medieval families had only a proper name and an amulet that had failed to hold. If this tension between a text that accuses and a text that gives a voice already speaks to you, say so in the comments. Because this investigation is about to show you where that textual battle was fought most violently. In a work written centuries later that turned this same figure into something completely different. Because the Talmud does not stop at two isolated warnings. One question still remains. Why did a mere nocturnal creature, mentioned only in passing in discussions of household law, end up, a few centuries later, with an entire mythology of her own? A court, a demonic husband, a cosmic role. The answer is found neither in the Talmud nor in the alphabet of Ben Sira. It lies in a text the Spanish Kabbalists of the 13th century would compose, one that would make Lilith into a figure far more fearsome than anything this investigation has shown so far. The question of the erased word in the book of Isaiah has remained open since the beginning of this investigation. Why did Christian translators choose a bird instead of a proper name? The answer can be summed up in one sentence. They were translating a Hebrew text at a time when Jewish tradition itself had already relegated this figure to the category of dangerous, marginal stories not to be taken seriously. Because the alphabet of Ben Sira never gained stable status in rabbinic literature, medieval authorities describe it as obscene. Others go further and use the word heretical, a term not used lightly in a world where every religious text passes through an informal court of legitimacy before it can be cited in public. For centuries, it remained on the margins, copied in the shadows and never absorbed into the canon of authorized commentaries. So when a Christian translator turned to Jewish sources to clarify an obscure word in Isaiah, what he had before him was a tradition already discredited within its own community of origin. A woman's name presented as folkloric curiosity rather than a serious interpretive key. He chose the bird. That choice was not a translation mistake. It was the legacy of a suppression that had already happened elsewhere. But why did this particular text trouble rabbinic authorities so deeply when so many other, far more violent stories circulated with little serious opposition? To answer that question, we need to leave the Byzantine East for a moment and move to an intellectual center that most documentaries on the subject ignore completely: southern France. In the rare books collection of a municipal library in Languedoc, a curator places a shriveled sheet of parchment on a padded stand, protected between two panes of glass. The ink has browned, and some of the letters have faded along a central crease where the document was folded and unfolded for generations before anyone thought to preserve it flat. A later hand has scrawled a warning in the margin, barely legible, which a researcher leaning over the display case is trying to decipher with a magnifying glass. It is only a fragment, a few lines from a commentary linked to the Provençal circle, probably copied several times before reaching this form. But that scribbled margin is enough to confirm what the literary sources had already suggested. This was never a text that circulated as freely as ordinary biblical commentaries. Someone, at a date that can no longer be fixed with certainty, thought it necessary to warn the next reader before he even began. Before Spain produced the most famous text in all of Jewish mysticism, a circle of scholars had already formed a century earlier in two cities of Languedoc, Posquier and Narbonne. At the center of that circle was one master, Isaac the Blind, who, between the end of the 12th century and the beginning of the 13th, developed the doctrine of divine emanations of unprecedented complexity. And among the concepts he shaped was a notion called the other side, the dark aspect of the divine structure, the reservoir from which evil, impurity, and disorder emerge. One day, a student comes before Isaac the Blind and asks to be initiated more deeply into this doctrine. The master refuses. What you are asking for is not passed on to anyone who has not yet reached sufficient maturity. A man who receives this knowledge too early does not carry it. It carries him down paths he can no longer control. This caution was no minor detail. The Provençal circle imposed a strict rule. No one could receive this teaching before reaching an advanced age, and only after proving intellectual and moral steadiness beyond doubt. It was a doctrine passed on in a low voice, from master to a single disciple, never set down on parchment meant to circulate freely. One evening, two disciples of the circle speak in hushed tones in an inner courtyard, far from the windows facing the street. One of them has just received a letter from a correspondent in Spain, urging him to put certain oral teachings into writing so they will not be lost when the master dies. If we put this on parchment, then in 10 years, any scribe will be able to copy it without understanding what he's handling. And if we never write it down, then in 10 years, there will be nothing left of it at all. Neither of them is wrong. That exact dilemma between oblivion and uncontrolled spread explains why so few treatises from the circle of Narbonne and Posquier have come down to us in complete form, and why what survives looks more like fragments, letters, and disciples' notes than an organized body of work. It was, at heart, the same kind of caution that had already surrounded the alphabet of Ben Sira in Eastern circles a century earlier. Knowledge considered too dangerous for wide circulation, reserved for an elite supposedly capable of bearing its weight. It is in this very soil, this doctrine of the other side, this idea of a dark part structurally necessary to divine balance, that the name of Lilith would find an entirely new framework. No longer just a night creature to be feared in an empty house. No longer a rebellious first wife staged in a satirical text, but a structural element in an entire cosmological system, almost a function rather than simply a character. As far as we know, the Circle of Narbonne and Posquier never wrote a treatise devoted entirely to this figure. Its disciples laid the conceptual foundations, the structure of the emanations, the polarity between the holy side and the other side, without yet giving her the specific name she would receive a generation later, when those ideas migrated to Castile and fell into the hands of an author who remained anonymous for a long time. And that is where this investigation has to make you a precise promise. In the Spanish text to come, composed from the Provençal seeds you've just discovered, there is one exact page, one identifiable section, where Lilith finally stops being absent from the canon, a note in the margin, a figure tolerated in the shadows. There she becomes a name, spoken alongside another, Samael, in a scene that rabbinic tradition could never again ignore or silence. That text is called the Zohar. And the page where those two names appear together for the first time in such a structured setting does not tell the story of a mere creature of the night. It tells the story of a marriage. But what comes next? That's where it gets truly strange. The Babylonian Talmud mentions a winged creature without ever explaining where it came from, as if the author assumed the reader already knew. That economy of words is no oversight. It's proof of an even older body of knowledge, one the Talmudic writers had no need to explain. Centuries before the first Talmudic treatises were ever written down, Mesopotamian scribes were already carving incantations into clay tablets against nocturnal spirits called Lilith, winged figures associated with the night, the desert, and the deaths of infants. The Babylonian world in which Jewish communities lived in exile, several centuries before the Common Era, already knew this family of night demons by that exact name. So the Talmud invents nothing. It inherits a Mesopotamian fear far older than biblical literature itself, and passes it on without needing to introduce it, because its entire audience already knew it from the streets, from the marketplaces, from stories of exile handed down from generation to generation. That is why a creature of the night could appear in a legal treatise with no explanation. It did not originally belong to the biblical world. It came from farther back, from a shared Near Eastern background that Judaism absorbed, then reformulated, and then, in the alphabet of Ben Sira, humanized by giving it a face and a voice. Half a millennium later, a text composed in Spain would do the exact opposite. It would take that humanized woman and send her back, this time for good, to the side of the monster. That text was the Zohar. Written, or rather revealed, according to its defenders, toward the end of the 13th century, and attributed by most contemporary scholars to a Castilian Kabbalist named Moses de Leon, even though the text itself presents its teachings as a much older revelation, passed down from a master of late antiquity. A prominent man of Guadalajara, a collector of learned manuscripts, is one day visited by Moses de Leon himself, who has come to offer him a few freshly copied pages of a text he presents as a rediscovered treasure. The man takes the pages in his hands and tilts them toward the window light to examine the ink, the texture of the parchment, the steadiness of the script. To the eye, nothing gives away any special antiquity, but Moses de Leon insists that he is copying these pages from a much older original manuscript kept in his home, one he never shows to anyone in full. The man pays the asking price, page by page, without ever seeing this supposed original. It is a trade in pages that will repeat itself year after year in several cities across Castile, gradually forming the complete text the whole world now knows as the Zohar. The question of that origin does not remain merely a curiosity for scholars. After Moses de Leon's death, a traveler and chronicler named Isaac of Acre goes specifically to see the widow to settle a doubt already circulating in learned circles. Is this text really a copy of an ancient manuscript, or was it the dead man's own work? Did your husband truly possess an original manuscript, an older one, from which he copied these pages? My husband wrote these texts with his own hand. When I asked him about it, he told me it was more profitable to say he was copying an ancient text, because men grant authority only to what they believe comes from a time that is no longer their own. That testimony, reported by Isaac of Acre himself in his own travel notes, has never been enough to settle the debate among scholars once and for all. Some see it as clear confirmation, others as an unverifiable rumor. But it sheds light on something essential about how a text acquires authority. In the end, it hardly matters who held the pen. What matters is that whole generations of readers received this text as a revelation rising out of the depths of the ages. And with that same unquestioned authority, they also received the image of Lilith contained within it. What the Zohar does to Lilith deserves to be heard plainly, because no paraphrase can do justice to the brutality of the shift. In a passage devoted to the story of creation, a passage that several scholarly editions translate roughly like this: She goes out and wanders through the world at night, tormenting the sons of men and causing them to defile themselves in their sleep. And she rules over all that belongs to the other side. That is the sentence that sealed, for the next 8 centuries, the image millions of readers would attach to that name. No longer a woman asking a legitimate question about the equality of her creation. A queen. The queen of demons, wife of Samael himself. The figure who in Zoharic cosmology embodies the accuser, structural evil, the prince of the other side. The Zohar does not merely fear her the way the Talmud cautiously did. It gives her a throne, a court, an organized cosmic power, the exact inverted mirror of the place divine wisdom holds on the holy side. Set the 2 texts side by side, and the shift becomes almost unbearable. In the alphabet of Ben Sira, a woman formed from the same earth as Adam, who refuses a submission she sees as unjustified, and who chooses exile over coercion, a gesture the text itself never explicitly condemns under divine law. In the Zohar, that same figure becomes the source of all nocturnal impurity, the consort of a demonic prince, the one held responsible for pollution, disorder, and the threat hanging over children and over men sleeping alone. The refusal of an imposed hierarchy had, over just a few centuries of textual transmission, been transformed into definitive proof of her monstrous nature. And that reversal is not just about a religious text written centuries ago. It reveals a mechanism history repeats with disturbing regularity. A woman, in any era, refuses the place assigned to her without discussion. She asks a simple question: why should I obey if nothing justifies this hierarchy except habit? No one answers her question. She is reclassified. Her status is changed, not her argument. She is no longer someone to debate. She becomes a danger to contain, an anomaly to explain away by anything other than the legitimacy of what she asked. A father today might say of a daughter who is too outspoken that she has a strong personality, and mean it without affection. The word changes from century to century. Heretic, difficult, disturbed, monstrous. But the mechanism stays the same. Reclassify the person instead of addressing the question she asked. That is exactly the mechanism the Zohar applies to Lilith, with an almost legal coldness. The narrative thread that first opened in the very first part of this dossier comes to its conclusion here. What the Zohar adds to Lilith's story is not just one more demonic embellishment. It is the final act of a process that began much earlier. The disappearance of the word in Isaiah, the faceless warning in the Talmud, the satirical text that was quickly pushed to the margins, and now the definitive codifying of a queen of evil in the most influential text in all of Jewish mysticism. 4 stages, one single trajectory, and at every stage, the same woman loses a little more of what the alphabet of Ben Sira had once granted her: the right to ask a question and wait for an answer rather than a sentence. But one question still remains, and this dossier has not yet asked it directly. If the Zohar sealed this image in place for centuries, how did a name so deeply demonized manage, in the modern era, to become a claimed symbol rather than a threat to be warded off? That transformation, the most unexpected in this entire dossier, took place in a specific place and a specific decade you probably would not guess. The third part of this dossier promised you one precise scene, a page in the Zohar where Lilith stops being a shadow and becomes a name spoken alongside Samael. That scene does indeed exist, and it does more than simply name a demonic couple. It tells of a union conceived as an inverted, methodical, almost bureaucratic reflection of the holy union it is supposed to parasitize. The Zohar describes a mirrored structure. On the holy side, there is a divine couple, the union of the king and the heavenly queen, the source of all blessing and all fertility in the world above. On the dark side, there is a couple that reproduces that same architecture, term for term, but turned toward destruction rather than blessing. Samael and Lilith, joined not to generate life, but everything that comes to corrupt it. The text stresses this almost geometric symmetry, as if evil could exist only by copying, point for point, the shape of the good it seeks to disfigure. Lilith is no longer just an isolated creature wandering the night. She now occupies a precise role within an entire system, the structural bride of evil, exactly as divine wisdom is the structural bride of good. This mirrored architecture, in a sense, closes the circle on everything this dossier has followed since the beginning. But it leaves one thread hanging, the circle of Narbonne and Posquier, that Provençal center where the disciples of Isaac the Blind had laid, a century earlier, the conceptual foundations of this doctrine of the other side. What remains in the Zohar of what they were transmitting? The answer is a bitter one. The Provençal circle passed on a structure, the polarity between a holy side and a dark side, the cosmological need for evil as a counterweight to good. What it did not pass on was the human dimension that the alphabet of Ben Sira had given this figure centuries earlier. A woman who speaks, who argues, who raises a question of justice before disappearing. That dimension was lost somewhere between Narbonne and Guadalajara, between the master who refused to initiate his disciples too early and the Castilian Kabbalist who wrote his folios for pay. The Zohar inherits the structure. It does not inherit the voice. And perhaps that is, precisely, the most significant loss in this whole case. Not that a text demonized a figure, but that it did so while erasing even the memory that she had once had something to say in her own defense. This mechanism is not limited to a 13th century Kabbalistic text. Look across the centuries at how a society treats a female figure it sees as dangerous, and you will find the same structure again and again in contexts that have nothing to do with one another. A woman accused of witchcraft in a small Western European town at the dawn of the modern era is almost never prosecuted for a crime she actually committed, and that could be proven. She is prosecuted because she disrupts an order, too much knowledge of plants, too much financial independence after being widowed, too outspoken in a village assembly. Before an ecclesiastical court, a judge flips through a thin file while an accused widow stands with her hands clasped, a small pouch of dried herbs resting on the table as evidence. She has treated half the village with that same pouch for years, and no one ever found fault with it, until the day a neighbor lost his fortune in business and looked anywhere but within himself for the cause of his misery. You admit that you prepared a remedy for this man on the eve of his ruin. A remedy for his stomach pains, as I have done for half the people gathered in this room. And yet his fortune collapsed the very next day. The next day, Your Honor, or the year after. Calendars are only useful to those looking for a damning coincidence. The court does not debate her knowledge or her independence. It recasts them as proof of a demonic pact, and the pouch of herbs that fed her the day before becomes, on that day, the silent evidence of a crime that no witness ever actually saw being committed. A woman diagnosed with hysteria in a 19th century Paris hospital isn't being treated for a disorder anyone is genuinely trying to understand either. She's classified, photographed, and displayed before medical students because her symptoms disturb a well-established idea of what a sensible woman is supposed to be. In a packed lecture hall at the Salpêtrière, a famous professor brings a young patient forward before an assembly of silent students, pointer in hand to indicate her posture, her breathing, the trembling of her hands, which he comments on the way someone might describe a collector's piece. Observe the position of the arms, gentlemen, characteristic of the phase I described to you last week. Professor, the patient herself says she knows why she's trembling like this. She attributes it to a recent bereavement, not to... What the patient believes she feels matters less to our study than what her body visibly presents before us. In both cases, the structure of power never addresses the objection itself. It reclassifies the person making it and closes the file. The Zohar applies this exact same logic to Lilith, not as an isolated accident, not as the cruelty of a single author, but as a structure of power that repeats itself, almost identically, every time a female figure asks a question the established order would rather not hear. For nearly 7 centuries, this demonized version remains the only one available, the only one passed down, the only one known even to the most learned Jewish readers. Then, in 1972, an American theologian named Judith Plaskow publishes a short essay that reopens a case almost no one dared to look at anymore. Plaskow doesn't simply remind readers that the alphabet of Ben Sira exists. She imagines a continuation that neither that medieval text nor the Zohar had ever envisioned. Lilith, after leaving for the Red Sea, eventually returns to the garden. There, she meets Eve, and instead of confronting each other, as tradition had all but required, the two women speak. They exchange their stories, that of the first wife cast into exile, and that of the second woman shaped from a rib. And in that exchange, they discover an alliance rather than a rivalry. A young scholar, years later, comes across this essay for the first time in a religious studies seminar, tucked in among much older texts she already knows by heart. She rereads the passage where the two women finally meet, twice. Something shifts inside her, not just academic curiosity, but the unmistakable feeling that a text centuries old has just been corrected, without a single line of the original being erased. You don't have to rewrite history to repair it. Sometimes, all you have to do is give it the ending it never dared to write. That same sense of admiration now runs through circles far beyond a seminar room. Women reclaiming that name, no longer as a threat to be warded off, but as a banner to be carried with pride. What remains is to understand how that reversal actually took shape, and which specific places and decades transformed that name from something demonic into a symbol displayed without shame. 3 facts, placed side by side, are enough to close the case. First fact: a medieval text gave a woman a name, the same origin as Adam, and a sentence of refusal that no religious authority ever managed to silence completely, despite centuries of exclusion. Second fact: Genesis itself has always contained 2 accounts of the creation of woman, and that textual doubling is not some accident of compilation, but the trace of a tension tradition chose to seal over rather than confront. Third fact: centuries later, a Spanish text took up that same figure and turned her into a queen of evil, the structural wife of the heavenly accuser, wiping away even the memory that she had once had a voice and an argument. One text, a double account, a demonization. There, in 3 movements, is the entire path this story has followed, from Isaiah to the Zohar. One final question remains, raised in the very first part of this investigation and never fully settled. Why did the alphabet of Ben Sira come so close to disappearing altogether instead of surviving on the margins like so many other minor texts? The answer lies in an act few viewers know about. In an Eastern community, one evening a religious leader gathers the handful of families who own a copy of the text and asks them, plainly, to hand them over. These pages have been circulating unsupervised for far too long. We're collecting them, and no more copies will be made. And yet some people find real food for thought in them, not just scandal. The reflection you're looking for already exists elsewhere, in texts that don't risk leading less discerning minds astray. A young scribe present that evening places the pages handed to him into a shared chest, just as he was told. Except for one copy, his own, which he keeps at home without telling anyone, tucked into the bottom of a prayer bag that is never opened in front of others. He has no idea yet that this quiet, almost ordinary gesture will allow this text to survive through the centuries to come. Several medieval rabbinic authorities did not merely push this text aside through silence. Some explicitly urged that it no longer be copied, that it be removed from community libraries, and that its transmission to future generations be prevented. A manuscript whose copying is forbidden does not vanish all at once. It dies slowly, one copy at a time, lost, torn apart, never copied again once the parchment begins to decay. That is exactly what almost happened to the alphabet of Ben Sira. It survived only by accident, through a handful of isolated copies, tolerated in more permissive communities, forgotten at the bottom of chests and in synagogues, until scholars, at the very end of the 19th century, uncovered in a Cairo Geniza heaps of fragments that no one had examined for generations. That day, a Cambridge scholar named Solomon Schechter climbs a shaky ladder to an opening high in the wall of the Ben Ezra synagogue, where for centuries whole sacks of pages have been piled up, pages considered too worn out to remain in circulation, yet too sacred because they sometimes bear the divine name to be simply thrown away. The caretaker accompanying him hesitates before letting him search deeper into this room, one few outsiders have ever seen. What exactly are you looking for in there? It's nothing but old, worn-out papers, fit only for dust. I'm looking precisely for what no one thought worth preserving anywhere else. Schechter spends hours sorting through thousands of mixed fragments in a harsh dust that makes him cough. Bills, letters, poems, biblical commentaries, and among them, copies of a text the rabbinic establishment had tried to erase centuries earlier. Among these fragments, found by chance and saved in a storeroom, where worn texts were discarded rather than directly destroyed out of religious respect, were copies of this very text the rabbinic establishment had tried to make people forget. The attempt to erase it very nearly succeeded, and it is that failure, that near accidental survival, that now allows us to reconstruct the full arc of this story, from the rejection of a woman fashioned as an equal to the demonic queen of an entire cosmological system. A manuscript they tried to erase ended up outliving the people who wanted it gone. Maybe that's the only justice this case can offer you. If this investigation has changed the way you now read that name, say so in the comments. And if you think there are other female figures erased the same way in those same religious archives, write their names beneath this video, and this investigation will go looking for them. Lilith is only the first missing one. Other names are still waiting in those same archives, in that same silence. A manuscript almost vanished it survived.